So for today, we're going to be starting on chapter 1, our introduction to microbes and their building blocks. Short overview of where we're going. Today, we're going to go through microbes, tiny but mighty, microbes in history, and then our next lecture for the second half of chapter 1 will be over macromolecules, the main molecules that make up cells, make up life, as well as the naming and classification of life. So what sort of nomenclature, naming, and organizing of the organisms we can do. So let's get going. Our first section, microbes, tiny but mighty. We have a couple of vocab words that we need to know to kind of have framework. The first thing is microbiology. And I know this is the class you signed up for, but the technical definition for it is our specialized field of biology that deals with living things ordinarily too small to be seen without magnification. So a couple of key words. It deals with living things. So today's lecture, we're going to talk about what actually makes something living, because it's a little blurrier than you would expect. Okay? So ordinarily, things too small to be seen. So we're going to discuss microscopes in the coming weeks and how we can actually visualize and see what's going on within the cell. Microscopic is a term indicating things that are invisible to the naked eye. So I can look out my window here and I could see a butterfly that goes by. I might even be able to see an ant, but as we go smaller down, I can't really see the microbes on my skin, or if there's salmonella in my food. All of those would be known as microscopic organisms. Microorganisms and microbes are often used interchangeably. These are just the living things that are too small to be seen without a microscope or at least some form of magnification. So that takes us to what actually is the definition of life and how can we separate things from living and non-living things? And you might think initially, wow, that's pretty clear cut. I know I'm living. I know my dog's living. I know the flowers outside are living. But there's actually quite a few exceptions where things get a little fuzzy. Things like viruses, where they can't reproduce on their own, but they can clearly cause disease and they can multiply and they have genetic material. Or things like mules, where they can't really reproduce on their own, but I mean, they're close to other organisms. So how do we actually separate if something's living or non-living? So scientists have come up with some basic criteria for what makes something living. And I have them here in bold. Our first one is they have to be able to grow. So a living organism must be able to grow in some manner. Most often this is converting external materials like carbon or food, things like that, into either more of itself, progeny, or additional mass. So this could be getting bigger or making more of them, but either way, it's going to be growing. In order for an organism to be alive, it needs to respond to stimulus. So living organisms must be able to respond to changes in their environment. They must be able to interface between themselves and the external world. And so these could be things like making a simple metabolic shift, like maybe now I've taken up running, and so now my body has to make more ATP and use energy more efficiently. Or maybe provoking behavioral changes of if there's some change in the environment, whether it's oxygen availability or plants growing towards light, any of these would count as a stimulus response. Metabolism. So all living organisms must be capable of converting energy into mass and mass into energy. Okay, so they have to be able to take in food, maybe it's glucose or sunlight, and convert it into energy or building blocks to be of use. Homeostasis is living organisms being able to modify themselves to remain within set parameters. So this is kind of similar to stimulus response. except for that they're trying to kind of keep themselves even keeled. Okay, so we'll learn later, but all living organisms have set parameters in which they're happiest. So it would be things like there's certain temperatures that humans like better than others. And if we go past them at a certain point, we won't survive anymore. And microorganisms are the same. They all have their set parameters of how much salinity they like, what temperature, how much sunlight, what the pH is, and they have to modify themselves a little bit, but they can only bend so much. Reproduction. So all living organisms are capable of replicating. So this can be done either sexually. So if you've taken Bio 1, we talked about mitosis and meiosis, the idea of having gametes to make more of themselves, or they can do it autonomously. So a lot of microorganisms reproduced asexually through binary fission. Another basic criteria of life is mutation. And that kind of makes us scratch our heads a little bit. I mean, you're like, mutation, I thought that was a bad thing. I'm trying to avoid radiation to cause damage to my DNA. And while that's true, all living organisms have to be able to change a little bit. So we see small changes in the genetic code over time that allows organisms to, again, adapt to their environment and increase their chances of survival. Our final criteria for life is autonomous motion. So all living things can move under their own power, and to varying degrees is the disclaimer I would give. So it could be very slight, like maybe it's algae floating in the ocean. They can move slightly, but they're not going to be running away by any chance. Or plants, there's lots of really cool YouTube videos where you can see the plants growing towards the light. So they're moving and reacting to their environment, though they may not have feet like ourselves to run away or catch the light, okay? But all of these, when we put them all together, give us a basic framework for what is living and helps us, again, if we think back to my last slide, about studying living microorganisms. All of the microorganisms we're going to study will be doing these things. They'll be growing and multiplying, responding to their environment. They have metabolism we'll talk about, and they're able to reproduce and change over time. There are a couple of some things that fit some, but not all, just a couple to think about. Things like robots, okay? Robots probably aren't going to grow, but they can respond and they can have some homeostasis and they have autonomous motion. Another one to think about may be viruses. So they can grow, they respond to stimulus, but they can't reproduce on their own. All of these ones kind of, you can see, make it a little bit blurrier when we think about what is life.